The Beatles were the biggest band in the world by 1968. With multiple chart-topping albums, record-breaking tours, and an unwavering presence in the media, their fame had reached legendary heights. But as much as they were united in their rise to stardom, their unity was beginning to crack. The magic that once made them a cohesive force was slowly dissolving under the pressure of fame, artistic differences, and personal tensions. Paul McCartney, often regarded as the band's musical genius, found himself at odds with the other members. His perfectionism, a driving force behind some of the Beatles' greatest tracks, was becoming a point of contention. John Lennon, whose avant-garde ideas and unpredictable behavior had always pushed boundaries, was increasingly difficult to work with. Meanwhile, George Harrison, who had spent years in the shadow of Lennon and McCartney, was beginning to find his voice. He was tired of being overlooked, and his desire for creative control was growing. These tensions were only exacerbated as the band entered the recording sessions for the White Album. By the time the band gathered in the studio, they were no longer the tight-knit group they had been in their earlier years. The Beatles' collaborative spirit had given way to frustration, as each member sought to assert his own vision. What had once been an environment of shared creativity now felt more like a battlefield. For Paul, the situation was particularly frustrating. McCartney's role in the band had always been that of the musical leader. His insistence on quality, structure, and perfectionism had shaped much of their sound. However, by 1968, his vision of the Beatles was at odds with Lennon's evolving philosophy. While Lennon became more experimental, delving into more abstract and avant-garde ideas, McCartney clung to the melodies and traditional structures that had defined their earlier work. This divide only deepened as they began working on the White Album, an album that would become both a symbol of their greatest achievements and the beginning of their unraveling. The recording sessions were chaotic, to say the least. Each member would show up at different times, with varying levels of enthusiasm. The collaborative process that had once brought them together now felt like a distant memory. Paul, who had always been the driving force in the studio, began to feel isolated. His frustration mounted, especially when the band's loose approach to their sessions clashed with his meticulous standards. When Paul walked into the studio for the recording of Back in the USSR, one of the first tracks for the White Album, he was already fed up. The song, written by Lennon and featuring his signature playful lyrics, was a direct contrast to McCartney's more structured style. While the others seemed to embrace the laid-back, spontaneous energy of the session, Paul's discomfort was obvious. This marked the beginning of a series of disagreements. Yet, it wasn't just the song that set McCartney off. It was the overall atmosphere of the studio, the lack of direction, and the increasing frustration of working with people who had different creative priorities. Back in the USSR was one of the first songs to be written for the White Album. A play on the Beach Boys' style, the track was filled with catchy hooks, energetic guitar riffs, and a tongue-in-cheek take on the American rock and roll sound. For John Lennon, the song was a light-hearted commentary on the Soviet Union during the Cold War. But for Paul McCartney, this track signified the kind of chaotic, carefree approach to songwriting that he could not stomach. The recording session that followed would mark a turning point in the relationship between the Beatles, particularly between McCartney and the rest of the band. From the start, Paul was unhappy with the direction the song was taking. It wasn't just about the content. It was about how the band was recording it. The sessions for the White Album were notoriously disorganized. Unlike their earlier albums, where they would collaborate closely in the studio, the band members were now often recording separately. There was little cohesion, and McCartney's frustration with the lack of focus was palpable. The recording of Back in the USSR took place in Abbey Road's Studio 2, but it was far from the well-oiled machine it had once been. McCartney, who was known for his perfectionism, had no patience for the loose atmosphere. He wanted things done his way, the right way, but his bandmates were more interested in experimenting and trying new things, even if it meant sacrificing the tightness McCartney sought. His dissatisfaction grew as he watched the others embrace a more spontaneous and relaxed approach to the recording process. In the midst of the tension, McCartney's frustrations boiled over. As the session continued, it became clear that Paul's control over the creative direction was slipping. The band's collective will was now shifting away from McCartney's vision, and he found himself struggling to hold on to the reins. While Lennon, Harrison, and Starr were happy to let things unfold organically, Paul wanted precision, something that was becoming increasingly difficult to achieve as their relationship frayed. The specific moment when McCartney stormed out of the studio is often cited as a turning point for the band. It wasn't just about the song, it was about the creative differences that had been bubbling under the surface for months. Paul's decision to leave wasn't taken lightly. This walkout was a culmination of everything that had been building up. The endless hours in the studio, the lack of collaboration, and the personal tensions that had been quietly growing since their earlier days in the band. Though McCartney would eventually return to the sessions, the damage was done. His walkout was a visible representation of the deep rift that had formed within the band. It signaled that the Beatles, as they once were, might never truly be the same again. The moment Paul McCartney walked out of Abbey Road Studios on that fateful day in 1968 was more than just a dramatic display of frustration. It was the beginning of the end for the Beatles as they had known themselves. While McCartney's decision to leave may have seemed like just another instance of creative disagreement, it had much deeper ramifications for the band's future. The walkout wasn't an impulsive reaction to one bad session. It was the culmination of months, if not years, of frustration that had been brewing between the band members. McCartney, who had long been the driving force behind the Beatles' music, had grown increasingly frustrated with the direction the band was headed. His perfectionist tendencies, once a strength that helped shape the Beatles' sound, had become a source of tension. With each passing day, he found himself more and more at odds with John Lennon's experimental approach and George Harrison's desire for greater creative input. The specific moment of the walkout occurred during the recording of Back in the USSR. McCartney had a vision for the song, but the rest of the band was uninterested in adhering to his ideas. Tensions escalated quickly, and after a heated argument, McCartney walked out, leaving behind his bandmates in shock. This wasn't a typical McCartney tantrum. It was a moment of realization that the creative unity that had once defined the Beatles was no longer there. For McCartney, the walkout marked the end of a particular chapter in the band's evolution. Lennon's response to Paul's departure was one of indifference. While Lennon had always been known for his volatility, he didn't seem to view McCartney's exit as a significant event. In fact, Lennon seemed almost relieved by McCartney's absence, embracing his own artistic freedom more fully in Paul's absence. On the other hand, Harrison had a more complex reaction. While he understood McCartney's frustration, he also had his own grievances with the way the band was operating, particularly with McCartney's growing dominance in the studio. Harrison's feelings about McCartney's exit were mixed, but it was clear that, like the other members, he was tired of the tension that had plagued the group. Ringo Starr, ever the peacemaker, was caught in the middle. While he didn't fully understand the nature of the conflict, he recognized that the Beatles were no longer the cohesive unit they once were. The walkout shattered the illusion that the Beatles were an invincible team, and it left an indelible mark on their relationships, both personally and professionally. The walkout had immediate consequences. While McCartney eventually returned to finish the White Album, the damage to the band's dynamic had already been done. The sense of camaraderie that had been integral to their early success had been replaced by an undercurrent of resentment. Each member was now more focused on his own artistic vision, and the shared purpose that had once bound them together was slowly eroding. For many, McCartney's departure from the session was the first clear sign that the Beatles were falling apart. But what made this moment so significant wasn't just that McCartney walked out. It was what his exit symbolized: the end of an era for the Beatles. Paul McCartney's decision to walk out of the White Album sessions was more than just a personal outburst. It was a seismic event that would alter the dynamics of the Beatles forever. The immediate fallout from his departure was felt not only within the band, but also by the loyal fans and the music industry at large. The question was no longer whether the Beatles could continue to function as a band, but whether they would want to. For McCartney, the decision to walk out was an expression of his growing dissatisfaction with how things were going. The studio sessions had become chaotic, and the sense of unity that had once defined the Beatles seemed to have vanished. But his departure also signaled a much larger issue. The creative direction of the band had become fractured, and the tensions between the members were reaching a boiling point. The other Beatles were, unsurprisingly, affected by McCartney's exit, though in different ways. John Lennon, who had always been the more outspoken and unpredictable member of the group, responded to Paul's departure with indifference. Lennon, who had already begun to embrace his own experimental approach to music, saw McCartney's walkout as just another part of the band's growing pains. For him, it was merely a bump in the road that wouldn't stop the band from continuing to evolve. George Harrison, however, had a more complicated reaction. Harrison had always been frustrated by his limited creative role within the Beatles, and McCartney's increasing dominance in the studio had only intensified these feelings. On one hand, Harrison understood McCartney's frustration. He too had grown disillusioned with the way the band was functioning. But at the same time, Harrison couldn't ignore the fact that McCartney's perfectionism and control over the band's output had stifled his own contributions. Ringo Starr, ever the peacemaker, took a different approach. While he didn't fully grasp the complexities of the situation, it was clear that the band was falling apart. Starr's role was to keep the peace, but even he couldn't deny that the once strong unity between the Beatles had become increasingly fractured. McCartney's Walkout was a wake-up call. It was no longer just about creative differences. It was about whether the Beatles, as a band, could continue to function together. The recording sessions for the White Album were already marked by discord, and McCartney's exit confirmed that the group's golden years were behind them. Abbey Road's Studio 2 is legendary in the world of music. It's where the Beatles crafted some of their most iconic songs, and it's also where their internal tensions boiled over during the White Album sessions. But what if the tension in that room wasn't just a byproduct of personal conflict? Could the studio itself have had something to do with the Beatles' fracturing? There are plenty of rumors surrounding the paranormal history of Abbey Road Studios. Some claim that the studio is haunted, its walls soaked with the energy of decades of recording sessions. Tales of strange noises, flickering lights, and eerie occurrences have circulated for years. Some believe that the studio's history, built on decades of tension, creativity, and pressure, has imbued it with a certain negative energy that affected the Beatles during their later sessions. Grounded explanation. While these supernatural theories are certainly intriguing, there's a much simpler explanation for the tensions that plagued the Beatles during the White Album sessions. Stress, exhaustion, and growing creative differences. The intense pressure to keep delivering groundbreaking albums, coupled with the constant media attention, would have been enough to drive anyone to the edge. Despite this, many who worked at Abbey Road during the Beatles' sessions insist that something unusual was at play. There are stories of engineers and assistants hearing strange noises in the empty studio, faint whispers, unexplained footsteps, and the sound of doors opening and closing on their own. Whether these were the result of stress and fatigue or something more supernatural remains up for debate. But even without the paranormal explanations, it's clear that the atmosphere at Abbey Road during the White Album sessions was far from ordinary. The studio's history, filled with the ghosts of past conflicts, was enough to create a tense and charged atmosphere that affected the Beatles as they tried to work through their personal issues. Was it the studio's haunting energy that exacerbated the tensions within the band? Or was it simply the pressures of being at the peak of fame, with the constant demands of recording and touring finally taking their toll? After Paul McCartney walked out of the White Album sessions in 1968, many believed that it could have been the final straw for the Beatles. However, the story didn't end there. Despite the mounting tension and McCartney's brief departure, he eventually returned to Abbey Road Studios. But his return didn't mark a peaceful resolution. It was, in fact, another chapter in the saga of growing discord within the band. McCartney's return to the sessions was, in many ways, an acknowledgement of his commitment to the Beatles. He had poured his heart and soul into the White Album, and despite the personal and creative rifts, his presence was still essential. But even as he came back to finish the album, the sense of unity that once defined the Beatles had been permanently fractured. The walkout, though temporary, had exposed the deep divides within the group, and McCartney's return didn't magically restore the harmony they had once enjoyed. In the wake of McCartney's exit, the other members of the Beatles responded differently. Lennon seemed almost indifferent to Paul's return, having already become more immersed in his own projects and the evolving artistic direction he was pursuing. Lennon's artistic journey was no longer bound by the Beatles' constraints, and he had begun to embrace an approach that was more personal, experimental, and, at times, confrontational. McCartney, in contrast, was still very much focused on the Beatles as a collaborative entity, and this difference in vision became even more apparent as they worked on finishing the album. Harrison, too, was dealing with his own frustrations. He had already begun to emerge as a songwriter in his own right, but he was still often overshadowed by the dominant figures of Lennon and McCartney. Harrison's creative freedom had long been stifled by the two, and McCartney's return to the sessions brought the issue to the surface once again. Harrison's own growing dissatisfaction with his role in the band only added fuel to the fire, and the cracks in their relationships deepened as they worked together. The tension was palpable during these sessions. The Beatles were no longer a cohesive unit working toward a common goal. Instead, they were four individual artists with different visions, and the creative process had become increasingly strained. The chemistry that had once fueled their creativity seemed to be gone, replaced by a cold professionalism. They were still making groundbreaking music, but the joy and excitement that had once characterized their sessions were noticeably absent. Even Ringo Starr, the most easygoing member of the group, began to feel the strain. Starr, who had always played the role of mediator, found himself caught between McCartney and the rest of the band. Though he was still committed to the Beatles, his enthusiasm waned as the interpersonal conflicts intensified. The magic that had once made them the greatest band in the world was slipping away. McCartney's return to the sessions might have temporarily stabilized the situation, but it was clear that the Beatles were no longer functioning as the unified creative force they once were. The pressures of fame, personal differences, and changing artistic priorities had driven them to the breaking point. What started as an idealistic collaboration had become a complicated and painful struggle for control. Though the White Album would eventually be completed, the seeds of the band's breakup were already planted. The atmosphere in the studio was no longer about making music for the love of it. It had become a battleground for creative differences. For McCartney, the decision to return was about finishing what they had started. But for the others, it seemed like just another phase in their inevitable unraveling. By the time the album was finished, the band had reached a point where it was clear that their future together was uncertain. Though Paul McCartney's walkout during the White Album sessions may have been a dramatic moment in Beatles history, it was far from the final breaking point. In fact, it was just one of many incidents that foreshadowed the inevitable end of the band. By 1970, McCartney would formally leave the Beatles, making the White Album sessions look like a relatively minor dispute in comparison. The reasons behind McCartney's departure were multifaceted. As the White Album had shown, the Beatles were no longer a unified creative force. Their once harmonious working relationship had been replaced by friction and personal animosity. By the time McCartney left the band, the group was no longer functioning as a unit. They were four individuals, each with his own vision for the future. McCartney, who had always been the band's driving force in the studio, found it increasingly difficult to work with Lennon, Harrison, and Starr. The creative differences that had been simmering for years were now impossible to ignore. One of the primary reasons for McCartney's departure was his growing frustration with Lennon's increasing focus on his own projects. Lennon had begun to delve deeper into his relationship with Yoko Ono, and his personal life was beginning to overshadow his work with the Beatles. This divide between Lennon's personal and professional worlds created a rift in the band that McCartney couldn't ignore. McCartney, always the perfectionist, wanted the band to stay focused on their music, but Lennon's priorities were clearly shifting. Harrison's role in the band had also become a point of contention. By this time, Harrison had developed a strong desire for creative control, and he had grown increasingly dissatisfied with his limited role within the Beatles. Many of his songs were relegated to B-sides or left off albums altogether. Harrison, like McCartney, wanted the Beatles to be a vehicle for his own creative expression, but he was constantly overshadowed by Lennon and McCartney. This frustration would later manifest in Harrison's solo career. But it also contributed to the breakdown of the Beatles. Ringo Starr, too, was becoming disillusioned with the band. Though he was less vocal about his dissatisfaction, Starr had begun to feel alienated by the growing tension in the studio. His easygoing nature had once made him a mediator between the members, but even he couldn't escape the strain that was now affecting the band. The joy of recording, once a constant in the Beatles' process, had all but disappeared by 1970. McCartney's decision to leave the Beatles was not an impulsive one. It was the result of years of mounting frustration, creative differences, and personal conflicts. The final straw came when McCartney became disillusioned with the band's inability to function as a cohesive unit. By the time he made his departure official in 1970, the Beatles were already a fractured group. The recording sessions for Let It Be, their final album, were marked by a lack of collaboration, and McCartney's exit only confirmed what had already become clear. The Beatles were no longer a band in the traditional sense. Despite the official breakup, McCartney's departure was not an easy decision. He had spent much of his life with the Beatles, and the idea of leaving the band was a painful one. But the creative and personal differences were too great to overcome, and McCartney, like the others, knew that the time had come to move on. His departure marked the end of an era, not just for the Beatles, but for music history itself. In the wake of Paul McCartney's walkout during the White Album sessions, many Beatles fans and critics alike began to wonder, was this the end of the Beatles, or was it simply the beginning of a new chapter for the band? The truth, as it often is, lies somewhere in between. For McCartney, his walkout was a pivotal moment. It was a moment of frustration and disillusionment, but it was also a signal of his unwavering commitment to the band. Though the White Album sessions were filled with tension and personal conflict, McCartney's return to finish the album showed that despite the turmoil, he still believed in the Beatles. His perfectionism, however, clashed with the other members' increasingly independent creative visions. As the sessions wore on, it became clear that the Beatles were no longer the same group they had been in the past. McCartney's departure from the Beatles in 1970 was the final nail in the coffin, but his walkout during the White Album sessions had already set the stage for the band's dissolution. The tensions that arose during those chaotic months were a reflection of deeper issues within the band. The Beatles had been able to overcome their differences in the past, but by the late 1960s, those differences had become insurmountable. In many ways, McCartney's Walkout can be seen as a turning point, a moment when the cracks in the band's unity became undeniable. But it wasn't just the walkout itself that signified the end of an era. It was the culmination of years of creative differences, personal issues, and changing priorities. McCartney's departure, though painful, was a necessary step for all involved. It allowed each member to pursue his own creative path and explore new avenues outside of the Beatles. The breakup of the Beatles marked the end of one of the most influential and beloved bands in music history. Yet, in some ways, it also marked the beginning of new chapters for each of its members. McCartney, Lennon, Harrison, and Starr all went on to achieve great success in their solo careers. The Beatles' legacy lived on, not just through their music, but through the individual paths their members took. As for Paul McCartney's Walkout, was it the end or the beginning? It depends on how you view it. It certainly marked the end of the Beatles as a cohesive group, but it also marked the beginning of a new era in each of the members' lives. For McCartney, it was the start of a solo career that would see him achieve even greater commercial success. For the Beatles, their collective music would endure long after the band itself had dissolved. In the end, the walkout wasn't just a moment of crisis, it was a moment of transformation. It symbolized the breaking of an era, but also set the stage for the future of the individuals who had made it so unforgettable.